Welcome back to Tom's Talmud Tisch. We're learning Masechet Sukkah. We're currently moving through the sixth daf, the sixth page. That's the large folio pages of the Talmud, Daf Vav Amud Aleph. Let me recap for a moment to bring you up to date. We were talking, or discussing, the origin of the heights of the Sukkah. The Sukkah that we dwell in during the course of the season of our celebration, of our joy, Zman Simchatenu. And there's much to be said about that. But here, in Talmud study, we're focused pretty specifically on discovering the origin of the halakha, of the legal requirements for these holiday observances. The sukkah, a temporary dwelling, obviously would need to be a certain size. That is the question. What is the precise size of the sukkah? As in, how small can it be and how large can it be? At a certain point, a sukkah could be so small that it would no longer be considered a temporary dwelling. How small is that? At a certain point, a sukkah could be so large, it couldn't be considered temporary. We had discussions about that as well. Now we're in the midst of ascertaining the Modicum height of the sukkah, which we essentially arrived at the conclusion was 10 handbreadths, or 10 tfachim. After analyzing a series of fascinating narratives and episodes, details, and specific descriptions of a variety of things in the scripture, the Gemara comes to the conclusion that the notion of 10 tfachim high doesn't actually derive from a scriptural source per se, although it is from God at Sinai. And the Gemara reverts to this notion of halacha leMoshe miSinai. That is to say, it's a halacha. It is specifically something that was ordained by God, but it was told from the Creator to Moses directly. It was an oral transmission or teaching. Moses passes that on to us. And so, my friends, the question then becomes, in our understanding, shiurim, which is a broad statement for measurements, sizes, weights, indicating the minimum or maximum of the particular item we discuss or circumstances we're describing, so that it measures up to the halachic requirements or limitations, shiurim are halacha l'Moshe miSinai. And the Gemara said, you've got to be kidding. Shiurim, halachic measurements, are ordained from God to Moses at Sinai? We have information that indicates otherwise. And the Gemara began to analyze the verse that describes the land of Israel. And it uses the imagery of fruit or produce. And the Gemara maintains, quoting a Brisa, that all of those fruits which serve to sing the praises of the soil are not actually about a wonderful harvest, but rather the notion of sacred soil. And sacred soil, what makes something sacred is that it becomes an envelope or convention through which we are able to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Gemara began to analyze chita and sa'ira. And we talked about gefen, and we talked about te'ena, wheat, barley, and we analyzed the notion of the grape, and then finally the fig. Each of them has a specific place within the notion of measurements and minimum requirements. And that brings us to the fruity pomegranate. The Gemara now continues. What's the story with the rimon? How does the rimon serve as a source for a measurement? And what measurement would it actually serve for? Says the Gemara, rimon, the measurement of the pomegranate, The Tanan, for we have a Mishnah. The Mishnah is talking about the laws of Kalim, the laws of human artifacts. Something which is made for a specific purpose. You could call it a vessel, but really and truly people tend to think of a keli or a vessel as something that can contain a substance, like a cup or a pitcher or a jug. But in truth, a keli is not only something that can contain something else, because containment is but one of many purposes. For example, a knife, a fork, or a scissors is also a keli. It's a keli because it has a specific function and purpose. And allow me to define that for you. You must understand that regardless of what a keli is made or comprised of, once it becomes a keli, we cease to look at what it's made of, and instead we describe it by its function. For example, if I showed you raw bullion or metal, what would you call it? You'd call it metal. A heap of metal, a clump of metal. You just describe its shape or its mass. But it wouldn't be described as something that has a particular use. If it's raw bullion, it can have a variety of uses. You can make everything from coinage to jewelry, everything from forks and knives to large machines. The point is, you'd see it for its material, for its mass. You'd describe it by its specific material, not by its function, because it doesn't have a specific function yet. Once, however, it's made or fashioned into a particular keli, now we no longer tend to look at what it's made of, but its primary identifying markings are what it is or what it's useful for. So if there was a styrofoam cup on a table, for example, and somebody would say, "What is that?" I wouldn't say styrofoam. I'd say it's a cup. Whereas if it's a broken cup, I would say it's just styrofoam. Because styrofoam describes the material. The cup describes its function. When things made of metal no longer serve their purpose, they're known as scrap metal. Shards of glass are not called a bottle. They're just called glass or broken glass. It doesn't matter if it's glass that used to be a pitcher, a bottle, or a cup. Now, it's just broken glass. And it actually can be recycled. You can melt it and do something with it. And today we are, and that's a good thing. The point, however, is that when it is functioning, it is not identified by what it is, meaning what it's made of, but rather by its functional purpose. So, for example, if we had a jug or a pitcher on the table, whether it was made of ceramic, pottery, glass, or plastic, if somebody said, "What is that?" or "pass the jug," they wouldn't say, "Pass the paper, pass the styrofoam, pass the plastic, pass the metal, pass the pottery." They'd say, "Pass the jug," because it's a jug. What happens when the jug is shattered and no longer can serve as a jug? They'd say, "Pass the material." At some point, it doesn't even look like a broken jug anymore. They're not going to say, "Pass the once upon a time jug." Well, it no longer is a jug. So they'd say, "Pass the pottery." Or, "Please clean the glass away," not clean the jug away. You understand what I'm saying. This is the notion of keli. Now, when we talk about the laws of ritual purity and impurity, we must all understand that this has absolutely nothing to do with contagium or filth, nothing to do with dirt or any kind of germs. The notion of purity or ritual impurity is entirely in the realm of spirit. It's a spiritual idea. We don't have the ability to identify or to see this with our five senses, but we believe it's true. It's part of a higher realm, a higher reality. We, the Jewish people, try to comport ourselves in accordance with the rules of the Torah, which include the rules of laws of purity and impurity. to be fair, in today's day and age, the laws of purity and impurity do not really apply to our lifestyles. And the reason is that, unfortunately, we are profoundly impure. And impure can also be related to the notion of sealed, non-sensitive, unable to relate to the higher spiritual consciousness. Once, our ancestors, our parents, our grandparents, holy men and women who walked the streets of Jerusalem and the land of Israel, once had a sense of higher consciousness. They were really and truly closer to God. They were closer to God because they had a Beit HaMikdash in their midst. And that represents the notion of God's presence in a manifest way. Having a Beit HaMikdash in your midst also means that God's presence is manifest within you. As the Torah ordains in the book of Exodus, when it describes the notion of creating that tabernacle or sanctuary, V'asu li migdash, you'll make for me a sanctuary, v'shachanti, and I, says God, will dwell betocham, and our rabbis point out, betocho lo nemar. It doesn't say in it, although it's speaking about a sanctuary, a tabernacle, it says in them. And in them means betoch kol echad v'echad. So when there's a Beis HaMikdash in the physical and terrestrial sense, then there is not only a profound expression of God's presence in that locale, within the walls of that particular structure, but via that structure, there's actually a higher level of God consciousness, a closeness to God that the rest of us, all of us, Am Yisrael, is able to achieve. Not having a Beit HaMikdash doesn't just mean that there's a mountain in Jerusalem bereft of its Jewish temple. It doesn't just mean that there isn't a place in which we can bring offerings. It means that the world is a darker place. You see, the Beis HaMikdash was an entry point, if you will, or a point of diffusion for God's presence to be manifest in our world. And when the Beit HaMikdash stood, in order for us to be able to come in proximity, physical proximity, to that holiness, in order for us to be able to appreciate or to ingest, to download that holiness, we needed to be in a sense of ritual purity. And that state of ritual purity, of course, happens when we rid ourselves of tum'ah, ritual impurity. Of course, again, something which cannot be described in physical or material, terrestrial, or in really anything part of this world. It's not like photons or radio waves. It's just not part of this world. It's not part of the rubric of reality as we know it. And I'm speaking about the full range of reality, from the Geiger counter that can tell you if there's radiation, to the radio waves that can be picked up with transistors. You can't pick up this holiness unless you're a big tzaddik. Holy men and women, they're tuned in. They have an added sense. Most of us don't. There's a lot to say about that. But really, true tzaddikim, in their own private space, live with that sense of closeness to God, even without a Beis HaMikdash. Very unusual. Not something that most of us are able to relate to in any way, shape, or form. So the more we are in a state of ritual purity, the closer we can come to this. And the more we're in a state of tumah, ritual impurity, the more we're sealed off from this. And the laws of tumah and tahara, the laws of ritual purity and impurity, are manifold. And they're really, really tedious and nuanced. And it requires a lot of study to understand not what it represents, but simply what it is and isn't, and what is susceptible to ritual purity, and how ritual purity can be removed. The Torah says, specifically in Leviticus, the Torah describes the notion of ritual impurity attaching itself to a keli. A keli is an artifact. A keli is something with a specific use. So if the scissors are broken and they can't cut anymore, you probably wouldn't call them a scissors. You'll call them metal, the thing. Essentially, it's scrap now, unless it could be fixed. And when it's no longer a keli, when it isn't an artifact, when it's identified by its raw material, it's no longer susceptible to ritual impurity. In order for it to be susceptible to ritual impurity, to tumah, it has to be a keli. And the keli, the artifact, can become cleansed. It can become cleansed if it's made of a variety of things outside of pottery through immersion in a mikveh, or if it's become contaminated through the most extreme form of ritual impurity known as death itself or human remains, then it can become purified also, in addition to the mikveh, through ashes mixed into specifically drawn water known as mei nida, or the para aduma ashes. If, however, we talk about something which is pottery, this is not possible. Pottery has unique halachas of how it becomes ritually impure, but also unique halachas of how it cannot become cleansed, immersed, or purified. So what do you do with pottery? Well, the Torah says you shatter it. If the pottery is shattered, which means it no longer serves its purpose, then it is no longer able to be a recipient. It can't hold on to the concept of tumah, of ritual impurity. That's essentially what we're talking about here. The question becomes, how large a hole, how large a crevice, how large is the area that is broken for a keli, something which can actually contain things, a container, to be deemed no longer a container, and as such, no longer tameh, and released from its state of ritual impurity. That is the question that the Gemara highlights here. That is what the Mishnah talks about. It says, Kol klei balebatim, all vessels which are used in the household. And the emphasis here is in the household. Shiurin, the shiur is kirimoinim, like pomegranates. And although it says in the Gemara, rimonim pomegranates, the Tosfos explains that we're speaking about one pomegranate. The question, of course, is what size pomegranate, because, as you know, there can be different size fruits. If you go to a fancy fruit store, you can get a jumbo fruit, and if you go to a regular fruit store, you're probably going to get a medium-sized fruit. So, some opinions, according to some, a medium-sized pomegranate will do. According to others, it's really a specialty item from the land of Israel, known as Rimoine Badan. And Badan was a place in Mishnah Israel, the Mishnah era of Israel, where the pomegranates that grew were most unique. High quality, large pomegranates. At any rate, this is a question, and we don't have a clear answer. I suppose the good news is it doesn't make a difference, because in our day and age, we're all considered to be ritually impure anyway. Although ultimately, when Mashiach will come, all of these laws will revert. But then again, Eliyahu will be on hand to clarify things for us. So the Gemara says that the notion of a rimoin is in order for us to know how much of a hole, crevice or break, needs to have unfolded or been sustained by a keli, by a container, and specifically one of balabatim, one that's used in the household. Let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, Kol kli balabatim, all containers or artifacts belonging to balabatim, literally a household item. Shiurin, Rashi says, be nikvehem, in their holes, as in an empty space, a crevice. Kirimoin, it has to be the size of a pomegranate. Pomegranates are fairly large. They're larger, as a rule, than my fist. Now, if you have a pitcher that has a hole, say, this big, would it still be used as a pitcher? Of course not. So why does it have to be this size of the hole, which means a really large gaping hole? Why couldn't a smaller hole qualify as disqualifying the pitcher from being a pitcher? Rashi explains. Kirimoin, the ad shenikiv kimoitzi rimoin, until it has the hole, that empty space formed, which is something that a pomegranate could fall out of, shem kli olav, it's still called a container. Umekabel tuma, and it will still be susceptible to ritual impurity, and if it was in contact with ritual impurity through a variety of ways, it will still remain ritually impure. Why? So Rashi's opinion is very interesting here. Rambam does not agree. Rashi says, Lafi shabal habayis chas al kelev, because people don't like throwing things out. That's just the nature of how things are in the house. We hold on to things in the house. In an industrial kitchen, stuff that gets held onto in the house is tossed without a second thought. Many people in their home will wash and clean even disposable aluminum pans. But by and large, in an industrial kitchen, when it's a caterer or factory, they don't look twice. They can't be bothered. It's just different when it's industrial. Furthermore, if you're selling something in a store, unless it's a secondhand store of used and abused items, if you're selling something in the store, if there's a slight damage, it's no longer going to be sold. We had a story a while back. Our dryer wasn't working. So we ordered a new dryer, and the dryer came, but it was so severely scuffed that the company that was there to sell it to us said, we can't sell this to you. Now, mind you, it didn't impede the functionality of the dryer in any way, shape, or form. And the dryer is not exactly a piece of furniture. So really, who cares if the door is dented or scuffed? I suppose no one, and then again, everyone. The company said, we can't sell something like this. And they took it back, which was kind of good because then the old dryer started working again. I guess you call that hashgacha pratis. Here's my point. Say a dryer is purchased, and say it gets banged up or scuffed. Does the person who owns the dryer throw it out because the door has rust on it or it's scuffed? I don't think so. We hold on to things in our home which are scuffed, banged, scratched, so long as they serve the purpose. If the dryer isn't drying clothes anymore, now you got a problem. You'll have to replace it. But when it comes to a store selling items like that, they don't sell items that are broken. As I said, unless it's a used and abused kind of thing where people expect to find broken items at rock bottom prices. And this is how Rashi draws a distinction. He says, if somebody has a jug and the jug develops a hole, the average Baal HaBayit isn't just going to throw it out because it can contain water or beverages. What's he going to do? He'll use it to hold something else. If it can't hold water, maybe it can hold beans or barley. Maybe it can be used to hold fruit. What if it has a hole, and a hole is the kind of hole that can have small fruits, like, say, olives? Well, in Israel at the time, pomegranates were extremely popular. They might still be. And because it was a very common fruit, it's good for you, actually, pomegranates, and people like the seeds. So because it was a common fruit, if somebody had a container that was kimoitzi zayis, which means a hole the size of an olive, they'd still hold on to it. The only reason you get rid of your container, if it's a household item, is when it no longer serves any functionality whatsoever. And that's when even the rimon, even the pomegranate, is not going to be contained, but rather it'll fall out. And that's how Rashi explains this. He says, Baal HaBayis chas al kelev. The Baal HaBayit, the owner, the household owner, is careful. He or she doesn't just throw things out. If you have a container that is large enough to drop olives, then they use it to store pomegranates. Avol klei uman. However, if we're talking about a professional item, an item that will be sold, limker, to sell, toher b'nekav kolshu, then it becomes pure, even with the slightest hole, because you can't sell defective items. It's defective. And because it's defective, so it no longer is considered to be a pristine example of, shall we say, that artifact, and it might even end up getting used as scrap metal or as glass that gets melted down. Why? Because the business person has no use for something that he or she can't sell. That's the point. The question is, does it serve its intended purpose? The moment it no longer serves its intended purpose, then you're ready to discard or recycle it. And in this way, the Gemara has demonstrated to us that the reason that the Torah identifies the rimon is not simply to tell us about how wonderful the yield of the land of Israel is, but rather that the land of Israel is sacred. Its soil is sacred because it enables us the possibility of knowing how to live a sacred, holy, mitzvah-infused life. And that's the story of the rimon, the pomegranate. Now, before we move on to the next notion, we've now moved from pomegranates onto olives. I just want to take a moment to point out to you that because the Torah tells me that pottery, earthenware, which can't be immersed in a mikveh, becomes pure when it's broken, I'm able to derive from this that other substances can also be cleansed, or the notion of the ritual impurity they maintain is essentially let go of. You have to be an artifact to hold on to that ritual impurity. Shards, scrap, can't become ritually impure. And it doesn't have to be entirely broken. It has to be broken to the point that it's no longer useful. And even if it can be repaired afterwards, once it was entirely broken in between, then in that case, we would say no ritual impurity is able to be attached to it. It's noteworthy that the Rambam chooses not to emphasize a difference between clay balabatim and between clay uman. The Rambam chooses to downplay the distinction, even though the Gemara says clay balabatim, and the Rambam does not believe that it makes a world of difference of who it belongs to. Bottom line is, once it ceases to be functional, then it can no longer be ritually impure. I suppose the Rambam, in his view, sees it as a second-hand item. The uman, who can maybe pass it off to the used and abused shop, in which it would still be able to fetch a price, even if a fraction of it, and it could still be used in some way, shape, or form. Okay, so now we continue. Rav Chanan continues to explain and to make his point. He says, okay, let's move on to the notion of Zeit Shemen. Eretz Zeit Shemen, the verse, the pasuk intones, a land of oil, olives, or olives for oil. What does this mean? Why does the Torah say Eretz Zeit Shemen, the land of oil-producing olives? Why does the Torah repeat the word Eretz yet again? And here, there's an emphasis on the fact that the Torah emphasizes Eretz. In fact, the Pnei Yeshua says, because the Torah mentions the word Eretz twice, it says Eretz Chita Usaora Gefenu Te'ena Eretz Zeit Shemen Udvosh, because the Torah re-emphasizes the notion of Eretz. This tells us that the kizayit, or the olive, becomes overridingly representative of mitzvah observance and measurements, as we'll see in a moment. So the Gemara says, Eretz Zeit Shemen means Eretz Shekol Shi'oreha Kizeisim. We speak about a land filled with mitzvah opportunity, all of whose measurements will be in the image of the olive. Now, obviously, this can't be all of whose measurements. We just indicated a whole slew of measurements which are not contingent on the olive. We just heard about a pomegranate. Before that, we heard about a dried fig. And prior to that, we discussed wheat, and we talked about barley. So when it says, Kol Shioreha, all of its shiurim, it's not to be taken literally. The Gemara says, Kol Shioreha sal kedaitach? Are you kidding? Where have you been for the last little while? We've discussed a slew of shiurim, and they were not the size of an olive. So the Gemara says, no, that's not what it means. Ha'ika hani damrinan, we have these we said. Ella, rather, Ema roiv shiureha kizeisim. Most of the measurements, not all mitzvah measurements, but most mitzvah measurements, or the most common of mitzvah measurements, that's the measurement of the olive, kizeitim. Rashi tells us, rov shiureha kizeitim. Rashi gives us a number of different examples, and I'm going to go through them with you together. Because otherwise you won't understand. What do you mean, roiv shiureha? Where do I see the range? Some things are olives, some things are pomegranates or figs. Well, Rashi gives you the examples. And he says, let's take a look. He says, number one, mate. Mat means one who is deceased, or corpse, or human remains. So we learned that a person who comes in contact with human remains is going to be defiled, ritually impure. There are three methods through which one can become defiled through ritual impurity, and they are, as we described in our previous class, maga, the touching, masa, carrying, even if you're not actually touching, and finally, ohel, the notion of being under a common enclosure. So how much human remains, how much of that matter, how much bone or plasma, how much flesh is considered to be a source of ritual impurity? And the answer? A kezayit. As we learn, a kezayit of basar hameis, an ounce of human remains, is considered the same form of ritual impurity as an entire corpse. Why is this? The Rambam says, Nechos tumas meis, that's because tchilas b'riyas shel adam b'kezayis. By the time the zygote looks somewhat human, the first image it begins to emerge as something identifiable, it's the size of an ounce. And therefore, smaller than an ounce isn't considered to be that which actually carries a soul or is connected to a human spirit. But the moment it reaches the size of an ounce or an olive, it becomes that which is related to a human spirit, and if that human spirit is divested from it, the emptiness or vacancy is filled with extraneous or negative forces, as we've talked about in our previous lectures. So that's the first thing. The second thing is nevela. Tumas nevela is the notion of the carcass of an animal. That doesn't make your steak ritually impure, because if meat is the byproduct of ritual slaughter, it doesn't actually become ritually impure. Ritual impurity is only applicable when we speak about an animal who was killed or an animal who died by natural means. How much animal remains do we need to be able to communicate ritual impurity? The answer is a kezayit. Where's the reasoning there? We don't look at animals as possessing a specific spirit or soul necessarily. That's true. However, we do see that in a nevela, an animal who dies naturally or is hunted and killed is prohibited from our consumption. We're proscribed from eating non-kosher meat. How much non-kosher meat would you have to eat in order to violate that prohibition? You guessed it, a kezayis, the amount of an olive. And because it's the amount of an olive, this is the reason that ultimately, in the same way we would presume that the amount of meat consumed that characterizes or comprises a violation of the Torah's laws of consumption, the same volume then would be of importance or meaningful enough to comprise a source of ritual impurity. Rashi moves on and he says, Iser chelev v'dam, the prohibition of consuming an animal who might have been slaughtered in a kosher way, an animal whose innards were carefully examined, and we now know that the animal was healthy. So it's not a treifa. Yet, the animal has parts of it which we as Jewish people are proscribed from consuming. Simply stated, the chelev, that's the forbidden fat of the animal, and the dam, the blood of the animal. Your kosher butcher knows exactly which fats to trim away so that you can have kosher meat. And your kosher butcher engages in a sophisticated process to ensure that there is no blood left in the meat. All the blood is drained and removed by a series of salting, rinsing, banging, and so on and so forth, cleansing. In the end, no blood is left, and that meat becomes permissible or kosher. How much of the forbidden fat or how much blood would one have to consume to violate the mitzvah? You guessed it, a kezayis, just an ounce. So once again, we have a kezayit showing up. Rashi continues. He says pigul. Pigul is when at the time of offering a korban, whether it's an animal offering or a flour offering, the Kohen who's performing his duties, instead of thinking about the korban as one should, instead of having the proper intentions, instead, this Kohen was thinking about eating it in its wrong time or wrong place. That would be mifagel. That would disqualify the korban, and its material is now proscribed from consumption. How much did you have to eat in order to violate this mitzvah formally? I'm glad you asked. That's right, a kezayit in Aleph. Moving right along, from the pigul, which is something like an offering that was disqualified from the get-go, we move to notar. Notar is an offering which was perfectly kosher. Right intention, right material, right place, right time. But it expired. Because different korbanot have different rules as to when it must be consumed. Some have to be consumed on the day they're brought, before midnight, or at least daybreak of the next day. Others can be eaten for as long as a day, 2 days, and a night that follows. But every korban has an expiration date. And if you eat it after its expiration date, you'll be violating the Torah. And it's actually a very grave sin. It's like eating something, eating chametz on Pesach. It has the consequence, the punishment of karet, of excision that comes along with it. So when you leave the meat over, or the bread over, you can't eat it anymore. And how much would one have to eat to formally violate the mitzvah? That's right, a kezayit. So now you're seeing the picture emerge. When the Gemara says, Rov shiyurim b'kezayit, most of the measurements that are going to be used here are going to be employing the idea of the kezayit, of the olive. And here we have a range of different things, from ritual purity and impurity, from proscribed consumption, all of which is essentially governed by the olive rule, the kezayit, the ounce. And then we have tameh. Tameh refers to a korban which became ritually impure, also considered to be a very, very grave infraction and a sin against Hashem. One is not allowed to eat when they're in a state of ritual impurity, or when the korban is in a state of ritual impurity. And how much would it have to be, or how much would you have to eat in order to violate this mitzvah if you were ritually impure? Kezayit. The answer is the size of an olive, an ounce. And finally, there is a portion of the hindquarters, which is called gid hanasha, appropriately translated, or approximately translated, I should say, as the sciatic nerve. So that area of the sciatic nerve is proscribed by virtue of Torah dictate. It's described in the story of Yaakov's wrestling with the angel. The next morning it says, Al kain le'yochlu b'nei Yisrael es gid hanasha. As such, or because of that event, Jewish people will not eat this portion of the animal. Does that mean that you can't have sirloin steak? Kind of. Because the process of nikur, of removing that proscribed strand or vein, is very difficult. It's time consuming. You need to be well trained, and that meat's going to be very expensive because you have to pay a highly skilled technician who knows precisely what they're doing in order to remove the prohibited stuff, leaving that which is permissible behind. And let me tell you, from my understanding, sirloin steak looks like sirloin steak. But once you have to chop it up or take out the gid hanasha, it doesn't look that good anymore. And it isn't really worth all that money. So I've heard that people have eaten sirloin steak when nikur is performed. I've never tasted it or seen it myself. I also understand from my non-Jewish friends that's the best cut of the animal, and that we get the kosher meat, which is only the front quarters. It works. I guess that's what we're used to. Bottom line, how much gid hanasha would a person have to eat in order to violate this Torah prohibition? And the answer? The answer is a kezayit. So the Rashi has introduced us to a range of things. And there are achronim, commentaries on Rashi, who query why Rashi doesn't include other things. There are a number of other things, and there's a lot of discussion about why we include these things in Rashi's commentary. Rashi wouldn't reach for other things. But at any rate, it is demonstrable that a wide range of phenomenon and material would necessarily employ the kezayit as its measure of preference, so as to indicate when there would or wouldn't be a crossing of the line insofar as a transgression of the Torah is concerned. The Gemara now moves to the seventh and the final one of the produce or fruits that Israel is praised for, the final of the 7 species. Says the Gemara, after the Zait, Shemen, it says Udvash. What does this mean? So the Gemara says, there is one consumption that is not measured by a proverbial serving or a kazayit, which is the olive, but rather it's measured by the date. And specifically, we are told, Kichesoves Hagasa, a fat, succulent date, one that's oozing with nectar, with its natural honey. That's the date we talk about, and that's B'Yom HaKippurim. That's the amount one would have to eat on Yom Kippur. So, just for practical purposes, the amount of a kizayit is about an ounce, and the amount of a kichsovet hagasa, the fat date, is approximately 1.26 ounces. So it's a little bit more. If you have to eat on Yom Kippur, we'll tell you eat less than an ounce. That's simple, the simple way. You really need to eat less than 1.26 in order not to fully or formally violate Yom Kippur, although if one eats a small amount of any non-kosher substance, and if one tastes any food on Yom Kippur, you would be doing a sin. It's just not as egregious a sin. So, for example, if somebody is in a situation where they have to eat on Yom Kippur, God forbid, because their health is at stake, because their life is in danger, we'd suggest and strongly urge them to eat smaller amounts and then wait a specific amount of time in between. But I digress. That is a subject for a different lecture and maybe a different day. Let's go back to the amount. The amount is the size of a succulent date, a fat date. Rashi says, dvash, honey. Doesn't honey come from bees? I know what you're thinking. Rashi says, kol mini mesika kuruyin dvash. Any kind of sweetener, any kind of nectar, any kind of substance that oozes with sweetness would be called honey in Hebrew. Utamarim mini mesikahen. And dates are particularly sweet. Of course, there's also a date called a honey date, which is even a sweeter date. But as a rule, dates are sweet. And succulent dates are very sweet. They have lots of nectar or lots of honey inside them. Kichsoives hagasa, choiseves, Rashi says, is a tmora, is a date. And why do we need that size for? Isn't the size of prohibited consumptions the size of an ounce, a kezayit? Didn't we just learn about that? Says Rashi, na, liyom kippurim. That's for Yom Kippur, the Gemara stated. And he explains. The leiksiv be'achila. It doesn't say on Yom Kippur, eating. It doesn't say, don't eat. It says, hanefesh asher lo te'una, the soul that won't afflict itself. So we need to afflict ourselves on Yom Kippur. We need to rob ourselves of life. Not suicide, but rob ourselves of that which usually give life. We need to feel a sense of affliction. And what is that? What is the thing that a person requires on a regular basis, and the lack of it is a form of affliction? The answer is food. If we wouldn't breathe for 25 hours, we wouldn't be. So air is not the answer. It cannot be that the Torah says during the course of Yom Kippur you must afflict yourself by not breathing. Well, what's the next substance we need to ingest or intake on a regular basis in order to stay alive? The answer is food. Incidentally, there are other prohibitions of Yom Kippur, but according to many opinions, they're only rabbinic. According to others, they're biblical, but the rabbis were given the right to govern what exactly that is. There are other needs, basic needs that people have, but not things that you die without. For example, the notion of bathing. It's a basic human need. If you don't bathe, you begin to stink. That's a pretty horrible situation to be in. Most normal people don't feel good about themselves when they haven't bathed or when they're filthy. And then they're having a good shower. Oh, I feel like a human again, you say. True. Not having a shower would be a form of torment or affliction. Don't bathe in Yom Kippur. Sometimes people suffer from dry skin. Skin gets cracked and it hurts. It's a form of affliction. How do you get relief from that affliction? The answer is you can use various oils and rub them into your skin. So even if your skin evaporates its oils naturally or easily, you can still keep things soft and supple. And think about it. If a person were to have hard, brittle skin, it wouldn't be a comfortable life. It'd be a form of affliction. And so when people can keep their skin soft and supple, that's a good feeling. Well, that's one of the things you can't do on Yom Kippur. So you're not allowed to bathe or wash yourself, even in cold water, and you're not allowed to use various oils rubbed into your skin. Intimacy is a basic part of the human condition. You don't die if you don't get it. But you feel you're missing something if you're a person who's married and conjugally active, and then you don't have that for a long time. You'd say basic needs aren't being met. In a circumstance where a husband refuses to be intimate with his wife, for example, that's grounds for an immediate divorce. Why? He's robbing her of her basic needs. He has a sacred duty and responsibility to provide shelter and clothing. That's considered a basic need. He has a sacred duty and responsibility to provide nourishment, food in a normal way. That's a basic need. And lastly, he's supposed to provide her with her conjugal needs. So if he's shirking his duty, or if she refuses him, that's grounds for divorce from a halachic perspective. And the party that refuses would actually lose whatever payment comes along with that. Point is, it's a basic human need, but not something you die without. That too is prohibited on Yom Kippur. So there are a variety of other things. Lastly, proper footwear is considered to be very important. The Gemara says, so whatever you have, get yourself a good pair of shoes. And from time immemorial, leather shoes are still the choice, the champion's choice. Whether people wear even a good pair of sneakers, they're leather these days. So leather is considered to be good footwear, protective footwear, and we don't wear leather shoes on Yom Kippur. Well, there you go. So, but these inuyim, these afflictions, are lesser afflictions. The primary affliction is eating and drinking. The question becomes, how much food would you have to eat to no longer feel hunger? Hunger is a form of affliction. That's inui. The answer is the succulent date, 1.26 ounces. As Rashi says, it doesn't say achila ela ashalo ta'una, the nefesh that doesn't torment itself or feel hunger, doesn't still its hunger. That's the nefesh. The nefesh that stills its hunger is necessarily violating the Torah's prohibition for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, also known as the holiest day of the year. Midi de mechayev daite umafkile mi'inui. How much does a person have to eat for them to be culpable? At what point does a person leave the condition of inui, of hunger, behind? Now, I know what you're probably thinking. There are larger people and smaller people. People who have the capacity to eat enormous amounts of food, and they eat lots of food, and some people who sustain themselves on a very, very small amount. That's true. But the Gemara Masechet Yoma tells us that everybody, from the Hulk Hogans of the world to a little tiny person, everybody can still their hunger with a chosevet by eating 1.26 ounces. The large person who eats copious amounts of food wouldn't find their hunger stilled for very long. It wouldn't be satisfying, maybe only for a moment. Whereas the person who's tiny might find a satisfaction that lingers or even lasts for a longer amount of time. But everybody would find a certain satisfaction. Everybody's hunger is stilled, even if for a moment, when you eat the amount of a cheseves hagasa. And therefore, the point is, if you ate less than a chosevet, if you ate less than that succulent date, you didn't actually still your hunger, assuming you were actually hungry. So it wouldn't be considered a violation of Yom Kippur. So we cannot look at the zayit, at the olive, at the ounce as the shear, because this is not about a prohibited substance. It's not about what's called a serving. It's about what stills your hunger. You, as the person who is proscribed from stilling his or her hunger during the course of those 25 plus sacred and holy hours. And therefore, we need the chosevet hagasa. Now, one of the questions that's often asked by people is, okay, I understand the business of a date, fine. Who came up with the idea of chosevet hagasa? Why does it have to be a succulent date? Well, one simple answer is that The Torah doesn't call it a date at all. The Torah calls it honey, dvash. And succulent dates are really sweet. They have honey. They ooze with sweetness. So the fact that the Torah didn't call it tamar or chosevet, the fact that the Torah called it dvash indicates that it necessarily would have to be the kind of date that's filled with honey. Hence, the Gemara's conclusion, it's a chesovet hagasa, it's the succulent date that comprises the prohibition of consumption of food on Yom Kippur. The Gemara now has advanced all of its arguments. We've gone through all of the 7 species and demonstrated how their sizes are used for the purpose of mitzvah measurement. And it's all from the Torah. It's all derived from a verse. That is the essence of the verse describing the land of Israel, which leaves us then with the question, how in heaven did we make the statement before that shiurim are halacha l'Moshe miSinai, that mitzvah measurements are ordained orally from God to Moses at Sinai, when in fact we have a clear and teaching, a clear brisa which tells us otherwise, which says to us that we learn the amounts of mitzvah measurements by looking at the fruits, at the produce, at the 7 sacred species of the land of Israel. So the Gemara responds, and the Gemara says, first the Gemara's question, Alma de Raisa Ninhu. So now I come to the conclusion that they are of biblical origin. Checkmate. You made a statement before. That statement seems wholly inaccurate. The Gemara says the statement is not inaccurate. The Tizbera, this is the way it has to be understood. The Tizbera comes to the word svara. Did you think, was your theory, that shiurin michsivi? Does it say, here is the amounts? Look at the land and its species? It doesn't say that. And because it doesn't say that, it's not actually clearly delineated or spelled out in the scripture. What we do have, says the Gemara, at best, is what's called an asmachta. Something to buttress or support, in English, supporting evidence. Shiurim miksivi, says the Gemara. Ella, rather, in the end, hilchasininu. We maintain our previous position. It is considered to be halacha l'Moshe miSinai, an oral tradition, a transmission that went directly to Moses at Sinai, that was passed on to all of us. However, in addition to hilchasa, which means halacha l'Moshe miSinai, that oral teaching, the kra asmachta, we then get supporting scriptural evidence. And as asmachta ba'almahu, it's only an asmachta, and as such, it's not something that we have to, say, find as a contradiction to the statement before that sizes and measurements do come halacha l'Moshe miSinai. At the same time, the Torah ordained that many of the things that Moshe Rabbeinu was told orally were alluded to, hinted at, and we could find supporting evidence in the syntax of the scripture itself. So what was the Gemara thinking originally? And what did the Gemara later come to its conclusion? Like, as they say, what was the Savaras Hamakshan? What was the theory, the thought of he who advanced this question? And then, what is the theory of the Tartzin? How has the Gemara changed its view by virtue of this response? What was each thinking? Well, it's explained by our rabbis in the commentaries in a variety of ways. I'll try to offer you a little bit of a synopsis of the different commentaries and how they explain the thought process or the operating theorem behind the Gemara's query and ultimate response. The question, of course, begins with, when we have this notion that Moshe Rabbeinu received things orally, and then we have verses that offer supporting evidence, the question is, do we actually case that as halacha l'Moshe miSinai, Or is that removed from halacha l'Moshe Sinai? Obviously, this would be oral. You couldn't open the verse and just read it and say, well, here it is. It says, chita, Eretz chita. It says, sa'ira. It's obvious what it means, because it's not obvious. But the Makshan thought that if we find supporting evidence in the Torah, that in and of itself declassifies it as halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and once we have supporting evidence, it's obviously an oral tradition, but an oral tradition supported by scripture becomes less than an oral tradition. It actually has a scriptural syntax that serves to advance this rule, this halacha or obligation. So the question was not about the matter of fact, because we all know the matter of fact. The question was, how do we view halacha l'Moshe Sinai? And as such, this little piece of Gemara is a foundational, very, very important piece of Talmud, because it serves to clarify once and for all the meaning of halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Halacha l'Moshe Sinai does not mean that it was only spelled out orally. Halacha l'Moshe Sinai means that even things which have supporting evidence, if you couldn't come to the conclusion without having the oral tradition, then it's not considered to be mid'oraita, a scriptural mitzvah. Then it would have to be considered what you know as halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And I'll give you an example. The mitzvah of tefillin is ordained in the Torah. It says, "Ukshartam le'ota yadecha." Tie it, bind it as a sign upon your hands. V'hayu letotafot beineinecha. It should be as a frontlet between your eyes. The Torah clearly ordains that we should do this mitzvah. And if you didn't put on tefillin today, you got to go put them on. It's a mitzvah to do it every single day. It's a mitzvah incumbent on all men, all Jewish males from the age of 13 upwards. Now, this notion of putting on tefillin, this idea of putting on the tefillin, binding it to the hand, and that placing it on the head is specific. In fact, we've delivered lectures, we had classes about this in the past, about the distinction between the mitzvah of the hand tefillin and the head tefillin, where the hand tefillin are about ukshartam, an act of tying or binding, and the head tefillin are an act of placing. But what do tefillin look like? That is halacha l'Moshe Sinai. That tefillin are, for example, biribua, perfectly square. That tefillin have to be black. That tefillin have to be made of leather from a kosher animal. That is halacha l'Moshe Sinai. There is no indication in the scripture whatsoever as to what the tefillin should be made of, even if there are some allusions or hints. The mitzvah is not a mitzvah halacha l'Moshe Sinai. There are no such mitzvot. The mitzvah is clearly spelled out in the Torah. The details, that's an oral tradition. The mitzvah of Sukkah says it openly in the Torah. Basukot teishvu shivat yamam. Sit in the Sukkah for a week. Spend time. You don't have to sit physically. Sit as a euphemism, as in have a seat. Make yourself comfortable. Spend time in the Sukkah. Don't just be there fleetingly. And you're supposed to spend a week in the Sukkah. Now, what exactly is a Sukkah? That isn't spelled out in the Torah. That becomes halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And since the Gemara tried to derive the size of the sukkah from a variety of different sources, in the notion of domains and the idea of height, and in the end the Gemara couldn't come with a clear and unmistakable conclusion, the only way for us to accept the actual size, the Modicum size of the sukkah, is to say halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And as to the idea that sizes can have supporting scriptural evidence, the Tartzin says that in no way diminishes it from being halacha l'Moshe Sinai, because without the halacha l'Moshe Sinai, I wouldn't even know to ask a question. When the Torah tells me, dwell in the sukkah, my first question is, okay, what is a sukkah? When the Torah tells me, a land of wheat and barley, a land of grapes and figs, of pomegranates and dates, I don't know what that means. I don't know that I'm even supposed to ask a question and say, land of wheat and barley. What is that a symbol or a size for? I don't know. I don't even know that it would have to be. The notion that we read into the concept of the 7 sacred species. The notion that we look into the things that Israel is praised with and say, well, what is Israel really about? As Rashbam says in his commentary on the Chumash, on that very pasuk in Deuteronomy. He says, the land of Israel is praised for its mitzvah possibilities, for being amenable to allow for the fulfillment of many mitzvot, which are conventions that allow us to nurture and develop a profound relationship with God. That is a beautiful oral idea, but not something I necessarily would have come to question on my own. And so in the end, I could have said, well, that's nice. The land of Israel has fantastic fruit. It has pretty produce, but it isn't necessarily coming to teach me a halachic legal ramification. Because I have a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, so now I can find supporting evidence or scriptural support in the pasuk. Anyway, this is how the Bayit Chadash, explains it at Biel Cirkish. So I'm following his methodology in explaining the theorem of what exactly was asked here and what was answered. And so, my friends, that brings us to the conclusion of the series on the 7 special species of the land of Israel. And the next thing we're going to talk about is chatzitza, or that which comprises an interruption or a barrier, because when the Gemara finished making its statement about the sukkah's height, the Gemara said shiurim, and then the Gemara said chatzitzin. But for this, you'll have to join me, please God, next week. Thank you.